written a book that was done from the perspective of an alien character.
Well, Nor Crystal Tears is done that way. And there's another series of books called The Damned, which involves a huge war that's been going on between multiple star systems, between one group called the Amplitude, who just want everybody to join their group because that's the best thing they can do, and they don't force you to do it. They just sort of convince you that it's the best thing to do.
All right.
Of course, if you don't do it, you end up dead, but
that'll convince you.
Allied against them is another group of diverse races, diverse species, and their biggest problem is they're civilized. They don't like fighting. In fact, warfare makes some of them physically ill. And then they stumble on Earth. And we turn out to be the only intelligent, if I can use that word, species in the universe that actually likes warfare. I mean, we like warfare so much that we kill each other. And the aliens on the one side, they're absolutely horrified by this, but they recognize how useful that human beings can be. So we become kind of the most powerful weapon in their arsenal. The problem, of course, is at the end of the trilogy, after the Amplitude, the mind controllers have been defeated, is what do the victors do with us when there's nobody left to fight?
Yeah, we're too dangerous to just leave lying around.
That's right. And I kind of leave it open-ended. I like doing that I like doing that occasionally because it's good to leave the reader and the film goer, for that matter, sometimes going out of the theater without everything neatly wrapped up and resolved, because then you go away thinking, like 2001. Whether you've read the book or not, the ending is open to multiple interpretations, and when you see people going out of a theater after your film has been done and people are talking about the film, I can't imagine a better resolution.
That's what makes a great sci-fi, fantasy, whatever type of writer out there. When the writer respects their audience's intelligences enough to have a film or have a book that has an open ending, where it is open to interpretation, that means that you trust your reader. And you're saying, hey, you're an adult, figure it out.
Audiences, younger people today, have grown up in a science fiction world. So many of the things that were talked about in the 40s, 50s, and 60s in science fiction stories, everything from handheld computers to iPods to satellite communications, were first postulated and presented in science fiction stories. But young people today have grown up with all this as a natural part of their surroundings. And if you try to put something over on them, they've grown up with these things. You can't fool them anymore. You get 9 and 10-year-old kids. You go into a theater and they see a standard Hollywood science fiction film, and they'll criticize the special effects or they'll criticize the storyline. They know when it's baloney, and you just can't put anything over on them anymore.
You wrote a series called the Ice Rigger series, and a few readers complained that why weren't the characters, if they're in this futuristic setting, why weren't they using GPS units?
Yeah, the problem is that the first Ice Rigger book came out in 1973.
Exactly.
And there was no such thing. And of course, this is one of the big problems with writing science fiction anymore. The pace of technological change has increased so rapidly that to stay ahead of the curve, you really have to project yourself carefully into the future. Otherwise, you get tripped up by something like that. When that book came out, there was no such thing as GPS, much less handheld GPS. So when the books are reissued, as I hope they will be soon, that's one of the things I'm going to go back and fix. I can't take that away from the book, but I can rationalize it and at least make it believable as to why they're not all walking around with satellite phones to communicate with the base station to get themselves picked up.
But in all of your books, even though, okay, you didn't have GPS units because they weren't invented at that time, you still have a lot of very original ideas that people have not thought of. That, for instance, in The Man Who Used the Universe, they use a lot of organic implants, of putting a creature into your body to handle your endocrine system and to handle the chemical aspects of your body. And I believe that right there is going to be the next evolution of humanity. It's not the use of cybernetics and whatnot. It's when we start using biological creations to do things for us. And you predicted that back in the 70s.
Well, you try your best. And people look at science fiction and they say, well, this is wonderful. Science fiction can predict the future. And it can't predict the future, but it's like the 100 monkeys analogy. If you get enough guys making enough predictions, the one out of the 100 that comes true will be the one that people focus on. And they'll forget the other 99 and they'll say, well, science fiction can predict the future. It's a famous early science fiction novel by an American, Edward Bellamy, called Looking Backward, in which he looks from the perspective of the 19th century into our century. And he has things like people traveling back and forth between cities by air, but they travel essentially by dirigible, because the idea of heavier than air flight hadn't occurred to anybody as being practical. And one thing that science fiction often misses out on is social developments. Mm-hmm. For example, in looking backward, women still don't have the right to vote, which we think of as unbearably primitive today, depending on what part of the country you live in. But Bellamy missed that one completely because he was so focused on the technological aspects of his story, he forget the social aspects of the story. Fritz Leiber, a great writer, both science fiction and fantasy, once wrote a story, I forget the title right now, but the idea was that eating in public is the greatest obscenity. You have to eat in private. You can't sit around with other people and eat, because the idea of actually consuming food in front of somebody else was considered an obscenity. That's the sort of thing that people like Robert Sheckley really focused on and managed to do some brilliant things with. And those are the hardest things to predict. Technological developments are much easier to work with.
Well, and one of the things that I liked about The Man Who Used the Universe is you had in the book that you had an underclass and an overclass, but everything was codified. If you were a burglar, well, you were simply at -56, and if you were a crime boss, you were higher in the scale. And at one point the character decides, well, I'm going to be legitimate now. But that actually happens in our world today, especially with our multimedia, where a person will suddenly decide, you know what, I was a politician, now I'm going to be a celebrity. And that's kind of a trend that you managed to calculate and work into your book. And that's just one element.
Well, again, it's the social aspects that are difficult to work with. And you have to remember, when you're reading a science fiction novel, that doesn't necessarily mean that the author believes everything they've written in the novel. They're simply exploring a number of possibilities. Somebody who writes a book about serial killers, that doesn't mean that the author wants to be a serial killer. This is something that happens even more frequently in motion pictures and television. You get classified as that particular kind of character, and it becomes very difficult for you to break the mold. That's why you're not going to see Seth Rogen doing Shakespeare next week, whether he wants to or not.
Tell us about Future Fighters.
Future Fighters is a film that's in, I guess, pre-production, you'd say, that's being done in Hong Kong by a very talented young gentleman named Guy Orlebar. Mm-hmm. And the idea is to do what you would call mecha science fiction, from the Japanese mostly, but do it as a Chinese-Japanese-American co-production with Chinese, Japanese, American actors. Ray Parks is on board. People remember him as Darth Maul from Star Wars.
Wow.
The director, I believe, well, I shouldn't say that yet, but it will be a name that people who are familiar with the genre will recognize immediately, mm-hmm. despite the fact he's not American. And there'll be a lot of CGI in it, obviously.
Well.
But the idea of doing this in Hong Kong instead of in Hollywood or at Pinewood in England is something that hasn't been tried yet. And I love the idea the characters are a complete cross-section of the population of Earth. Too many times when you see a far future film, it looks like everybody was cast from Topeka.
Yeah, they're all white people.
Well, essentially, yes. Or they're white people with your, occasional black American or your occasional Asian American, but they're all Americans if it's produced in America. The idea of doing a science fiction film that actually reflects the population of the Earth, drawing your actors from the population of Earth instead of just from central casting in Los Angeles, is something that hasn't been done before. The fact that it'll be shot in Hong Kong, I think, adds something else of great interest to it. It'll be very interesting to see what the reaction to the final film is.
So it could be safely said that you're part of film history right now, because this is something that hasn't been done before.
Well, if you live long enough, you become history. The things that you do every day, you don't assume mean anything special necessarily. It's just your life. It's why when you want to do interviews, for example, with other people who've done remarkable things in the past, and a lot of times they don't think they've done anything remarkable because it's just their lives. I had a gal come to me one time who was nearly killed. It was part of an initiation rite for some weird cult in Arizona, and she wanted to do a book about that. And in the course of helping her with her story, I found out that her grandfather rode with Pancho Villa. He was a mining engineer, and
Wow.
became friends with Pancho Villa and rounded all over the Southwest with him. And I said, well, your story is very interesting, and I understand it's very personal, but a lot of people would like to know about your father, your grandfather, and Pancho Villa. She said, oh, that's just my there's nothing there. And so a lot of history gets lost that way.
Well, also, you're a storyteller, and so if a person tells you a story and then they mention something that's offhand, they mention a detail, then you're going to take that detail and that will become a story.
If they'll let me, or I'll try to work that into a book. I did a book set in New Guinea. It's a contemporary adventure novel. It's not science fiction or fantasy. That's because New Guinea doesn't need any elaboration. It's the most incredible place you could ever possibly go.
Oh, yeah.
And I've made several trips there, and the stories that people would tell me were so fantastic and so unbelievable that they didn't need any fantastical enhancement. I just put them directly into the book. And if you're lucky, people will, if you listen, there's an old Chinese saying, man with mouth open all the time hears nothing. If you just listen to people, they tell you the most wonderful stories.